10 years ago, I was not really in a position to talk about this, right? I was a relative nobody online. Nobody was following my content. Nobody knew who I was now. But now, today, Harmon Smith is the most feared name in gaming YouTube. I am the one who will call out the grifters, expose them all, and discuss the things that they won't ever dare acknowledge. And today, we are going to be talking a little bit about the grifter Grummz and his overall purpose, and how this has held gaming back for over a decade, right? For those of you who don't remember, 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, Gamergate hit. People began to realize that there was something wrong with gaming journalism. All of this stuff that was, talked about in online circles, that was known among core enthusiasts, suddenly became mainstream, and people began to criticize gaming journalism. Now, looking back on this is really interesting because people didn't want to acknowledge the actual problem, PlayStation and Xbox, the Western third-party scene. They wanted to do this weird thing where they wanted to blame fringe weirdos. They made the issue overly political. Instead of talking about the actual problems in game dev, the fact that the Western gaming sphere simply wasn't capable of producing good games because they didn't put the time, resources, build up talent. Instead of acknowledging the reality of the situation 10 years ago, that Nintendo was up and away the greatest developer in the industry with the best consoles and the best games, that gaming journalism was propping up titles like Destiny, like Overwatch, like The Witcher 3, Bloodborne, all this absolute slop. Instead of acknowledging just, what actually caused gaming journalism to become irrelevant, which was the Nintendo Direct, people did this weird thing where they tried to act as if people were getting tired of video games because of the over-politicalization, when even today, that's not really that big of an issue, right? When you look at the grand scheme of things, the problem with modern gaming has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with politics. The problem fundamentally is that these developers are not capable of producing good games. However, people like Grummz, people like the Critical Drinker, people like everyone else in the anti-woke sphere, Mr. Medicare, Clownfish TV, It's a Gundam, Ricada Law, each and every single one of these people refuses to acknowledge this simple fact. The simple reality of the situation, that Nintendo was completely unaffected by the decline in gaming in order to mourn the loss of something they never really had. This idea that PlayStation and Xbox were these huge juggernaut platforms with a large array of wildly creative games, right? Again, it was never true. It was never real to begin with. The only thing that changed is that you began to realize that PlayStation and Xbox weren't good consoles, that they didn't really have good games, and that they were not able to remain competitive, and that they were just rehashes of pre-existing material. That's becoming more commonly understood. It's more well known. More and more people are addressing the movie game thing. Even if they don't acknowledge that, Metal Gear Solid started the trend. Back in the day, people would prop up Metal Gear Solid, against Ocarina of Time. Obviously, Ocarina of Time is better, but gaming journalism pushed this meme that Metal Gear Solid was the future, and that led us down the path where we went from, from cinematic action game with Metal Gear to horror-themed walking sim with Silent Hill 2 to just not even a real video game with Life is Strange, right? There was a very clear, natural progression over the past 20 years from these Western gaming studios, right? They wanted They did not want to actually produce video games. And that in and of itself is why Nintendo is by far the best company in the industry and always has been and will be for quite a long time. I don't know when and how they're going to fall off if or even if it will happen. But the thing that really gets me about this, the looking back on the history of Gamergate, what certain people are doing now, what Grummz himself has done, over the past decade, the narrative going into this with 2014 was that Nintendo would be the most woke, the most compromised, and the first to fall in the line of dominoes when it comes to the decline of gaming. Actually, not only would they be the first to fall, they fell back in the 80s. Like Nintendo was never good. And you've seen this idea surface a lot in anti-woke circles, right? We saw like the Tokyo Mirage Sessions thing, the Xenoblade Chronicles X like censorship debacle, Fire Emblem Fates and the face rubbing thing. It's really interesting how the narrative around the 2015-2016 period revolved around Nintendo when in reality that was around the time that Overwatch was coming out and Blizzard was doing all their shady promotional deals with like utilizing porn sites so people recognize their characters, like whoring out Tracer and then like doing what they did with the bait and switch, pretending Tracer is a lesbian, like lesbians don't exist. Clearly there were good guys and bad guys in this situation. Nintendo was producing new, interesting video games in 2015, and Blizzard was producing Overwatch. But the industry overwhelmingly threw their weight behind Overwatch. They gaslit everyone into thinking this was some major deal, that this was some like, bastion of creativity in gaming, like, oh, it actually has color. Never mind that Splatoon came out a year before and was far superior on a better console, right? Splatoon has better lore, it has better mechanics. It's just overall a far stronger IP than Overwatch has. And over the past 9 years, we've seen Overwatch die a death. You might as well call it Undertale because it's just as dead and buried. When you look at like just how Overwatch was treated, when you compare it to just how Nintendo games were treated, you see a very clear distinction. When a Nintendo game comes out, it's either not talked about at all or heavily downplayed and ignored. Just look at like what happened with Mario and Luigi Brothership, Princess Peach Showtime, Echoes of Wisdom. All of those were Emio the Smiling Man. All those games were fantastic. Far from the best, far from the only great games to come out on Nintendo consoles last year, but all of them, especially Brothership, were attacked by game journals who religiously kind of refused to acknowledge the benefits of these games. And then meanwhile, on the flip side, you have people like propping up absolute bullshit, obsessing over them for no reason whatsoever. I'm talking about games like Stellar Blade, Black Myth Wukong, and most recently, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. The mindset among people like Grummz, the argument among like the gaming YouTube community is that these games are based. These games are for the gamers because they don't have any weird political agendas, and they're not going to cuck to the anti-SJ. They're not going to cuck to the SJWs because our guy Vavra is based. Like, oh man, he said all these mean things on Twitter to SJWs in 2015. Like, please don't pay attention to the fact that his company is owned by Embracer now. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is going to be more of the same base content we've come to expect from this trusted studio. Like, ooh, Stellar Blade. They say they're not going to censor their costumes. Well, guess what? Everything that these games were prompted to be, everything they were hyped up to be, everything that Grummz like started jerking off to, all of it just completely imploded. And not only did it implode, the community refuses to admit that it imploded. Stellar Blade is a really good example because this is a game that didn't resonate well with anybody. It doesn't really have anything going for it. Everyone hates the gameplay, the style, the story, the mechanics, the visual. Like, when the only thing that people care about is how your protagonist looks, you failed. Okay? Like, it's kind of like nobody cares about anything else in regards to Stellar Blade other than the fact that, like, Eve is hot. And, like, it's just. Well, what about the gameplay? No, but Eve shows a lot of skin though. It's a gigantic cope, you know? Like this idea that somehow this shift up produced like a based video game because it has an attractive character is just appalling to me. And this really goes to show you just what Grummz is trying to do in that he's trying to act as if this is the most important thing about video games. You know, having something you can like whack it to. You know, never mind like actually having good mechanics or an interesting story or a setting. Like the only thing that matters is that Eve is hot. And even if they censor it, it's still okay because it still made game journos mad. You know, this is the issue with Grummz. The reason why I have really started loathing him over the past year or so, you know, I felt this way for quite some time. I've made no secret of it, but I haven't really been talking about it because, you know, I don't follow Grummz. I don't care what he says, but it does need to be addressed, you know, like Grummz is essentially a pressure release valve for anti-woke backlash. You know, he's the guy who comes in and sweeps up whenever any of these Western studios like start doing anything shady or doing something the fans don't like. You know, whether it's trying to gaslight people into thinking that homosexuality is okay in Kingdom Come Deliverance, it's not. And that's especially true in regards to the first game as well. Like, no exceptions. Kingdom Come Deliverance was never based to begin with. You know, whether it's like, you know, simping for Stellar Blade, you know, trying to act like having an attractive female in games is like some unheard of concept. It isn't. You know, like when you look at Grummz, you see someone who doesn't have any real experience in game dev, who doesn't understand what the actual problem is, and is not promoting the stuff that actually runs contrary to the things he claims to hate. If anything, he's just kind of like endorsing it in a way, because there is no denying at this stage that Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is extremely woke. And people have been pointing out the possibility of this happening for quite a long time. But people like Grummz were insisting that, like, this is all unconfirmed. That we don't know if this is happening yet. Let's wait and see. The first game was great. And now they're running damage control, trying to gaslight people into thinking that being lied to by a developer is acceptable under any circumstance, right? To me, this is why we as gamers cannot respect Grummz. We can't respect any of these grifters. We can't take anything they say seriously because they will not acknowledge the actual real problems. You know, they will not admit that PC, PlayStation, and Xbox are dead-end brands, that they are completely compromised, that there is no hope of recovery for them, not because of any political ideology, but simply because they have not cultivated the talent over the generations to consistently put out good games the way Nintendo has. And to me, this is the big, like, shocking thing about the anti-woke movement, you know, is just how often Grummz and people like him, you know, even Angry Joe, who leans more onto the woke side, I've seen these people try and downplay Nintendo games by accusing their products of being woke. You know, like most recently I saw someone try and say that like Nintendo of America had a problem with female Mario Kart racers and wearing dresses in the new one. It's like, nothing we've heard suggested that. You know, I've heard these people say that Emio the Smiling Man was censored, and all I can say to that is, like, you obviously didn't play the game. You know, like you keep hearing like these stories about like, oh, Nintendo is censoring. Oh, Grummz himself shared this one. You know, this idea that Nintendo of America is censoring like niche Japanese games like Neptunia, but it's a complete hoax. You know, like if you look into it a little bit, you realize that like, no other developer seems to be having any problems on the eShop other than these budget, sloppy, just unfinished messes that nobody really cares about anyway. Like games that are clearly being either being blocked because of quality concerns or aren't actually being blocked at all. This idea that Neptunia is too sexy for Nintendo consoles just has no real basis in reality. And yet, for some reason, Grummz will come out and endorse the narrative anyway. Like when you look at the people who actually like care about these games, when you look at like that the Operation Second Rainfall guy, unbelievably cringe, right? When you look at just like what these people are doing, like you understand just how that is a complete nothing burger, like and yet they try and like put it on the same pedestal or make it seem worse than what like other developers are doing. All the while doing damage control for mediocre products that clearly are going to be seen as a lesser product than the initial entry. And again, like the thing about Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is that this follows a very specific pattern that has clearly been established since at the very least, like The Last of Us. Right? The idea that like the developers release like a based traditional video game that appeals to the masses, and then with the sequel they introduce the woke content. They introduce like the subversive nature of it and try gaslighting people into thinking that's what makes it a masterpiece, right? They can't throw woke content at you right away because otherwise you'll just not watch it, right? And to me, I think the big solution to this is just to be more discerning when it comes to games you get excited about. Why exactly did you pre-order? Would you pre-order Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 before you had a complete 100% like understanding of what was going to be in the game? Right? To me, it's interesting being like a Nintendo fan over the past 10 years and having really no problems with quality at all. You can argue that like there have been games I've played that I don't like and stuff like that, but I've never felt like Nintendo has done what these Kingdom Come Deliverance guys do. Like every other release, it feels like is some major controversy on PlayStation or Xbox. What they did with Dragon Quest and like the Type A Type B thing. When you look at like the cancellations and the layoffs and all this stuff that's happening, like what is Nintendo doing that's like that? And the answer is not a whole lot. Like it's kind of amazing, honestly, seeing people just refuse to address the elephant in the room that like Nintendo just doesn't have these problems. Now, there is a real possibility that they may be introduced later on down the line, but what you have to understand that in 2025, like this stuff is clearly on the decline. It's simply not going to be around in the same capacity 10 years from now. Like Disney's already scaling back a lot. All these super woke companies have realized that like this all-in strategy has just completely destroyed their brands. And like, as it stands now, Nintendo hasn't even really done anything. The worst that's happened is that like some Nintendo of America people have like thrown them's where they don't belong, and that's becoming a meme in and of itself. So like people are realizing that the singular they them is not a real thing, because of what they did. It's it's interesting to see it happen. See the realities of the consequences of these the actions of these developers, and seeing just how little of an impact it's actually having on like the grand scheme of things. Because even if PlayStation and Xbox didn't go in on the woke stuff, they still wouldn't be able to compete with Nintendo. They would still be making the same mistakes of being overly reliant on Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto. Again, it feels like the political nature of gaming right now is kind of a crutch. Instead of acknowledging like the real strengths and weaknesses of these developers, we've instead like regressed to being just, obsessing over politics, obsessing over other people's personal views instead of actually evaluating and talking about video games. Grummz is a complete and total fraud and should be thought of as such.